The moment I saw those 3 squad cars screaming up my gravel driveway, kicking up a storm of dust and grit at 6 in the morning, I knew the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association had finally crossed a line they couldn't uncross. But what they didn't realize was that they hadn't just started a fight with a local machinist. They had just handed me the keys to their $4 million empire of lies. My name is Silas Vance, and that morning, through the hazy dew clinging to the pine needles, I watched as police officers surrounded my brother, Caleb, who was sitting there in his customized wheelchair at the edge of the pier, just trying to catch a few bass before the heat of the day set in. Now, you have to understand something about Caleb. He didn't just lose his legs in a roadside explosion outside Kandahar. He lost his sense of place in the world. And this lake, this 3-acre stretch of crystal clear water that our grandfather dug with his own sweat and a rented backhoe back in the late 50s, was the only thing that brought him back to us. It was his sanctuary, his therapy, the only place where the roar of the world faded into the soft plop of a lure hitting the surface. And yet, there he was, being treated like an armed insurgent on his own damn property, because some woman with too much time and a god complex decided she owned the water. Enter Evelyn Thorne, the kind of woman who wears a designer blazer to a backyard barbecue just so you know she's better than you, and who carries an iPad around like it's a scepter of divine right. She'd moved into the new Oak Ridge subdivision about 5 years ago and clawed her way to the HOA presidency within 6 months, and ever since then, she'd been on a crusade to, beautify, the neighborhood, which basically meant making life a living hell for anyone whose house didn't end oppos. T looked like a page from a minimalist catalog. Our property, the Vance family plot, was an enclave, 12 acres of old-growth timber, and that beautiful spring-fed lake that the subdivision had been built around, but we weren't into oppos. T part of their association, we were here first, a fact that Evelyn Thorne simply couldn't in oppos. T's stomach. The first time she ever stepped foot on my land, I was out in the shop, elbows deep in a transmission, and I smelled her perfume, that cloying, expensive floral scent that stays in your nostrils for a week before I even saw her. She stood there on the edge of my grease-stained concrete, looking at me with a look of pure, unadulterated pity, and told me that the visual disharmony, of my workshop was affecting the property values of the, real, residents, and that the HOA was, prepared to annex, our lake to ensure its proper environmental stewardship. I remember laughing in her face, wiping my hands on a shop rag, and telling her that the only way she was getting that lake was if she bought it at a price she couldn't and oppos afford, and I thought that was the end of it. But Evelyn Thorne wasn't an oppos. The type to take an oppos. No an oppos. For an answer, she was the type to sharpen her knives in the dark. Over the next 6 months, the harassment escalated from annoying to surgical. First, it was the anonymous reports to the county about, illegal industrial runoff, Then it was the noise complaints about Caleb's motorized wheelchair, claiming the low hum of the electric motor was, disruptive to the migratory patterns of local waterfowl, It was insane, it was petty, and it was working because Caleb started to pull back. He started staying in the house, staring at his rods and reels with a look of defeat that broke my heart more than any injury ever could. And I watched him wither, while Evelyn Thorne cruised by in her white Mercedes, smiling like she'd already won. But here's the thing about people who build their lives on bullying. They always assume that because you're quiet, you're weak, and they never stop to wonder if you're just waiting for them to make a mistake. The morning of the 911 call was that mistake. When the lead officer, a guy named Miller who I'd gone to high school with, realized he'd been called out to, trespassing, on a property that had been the Vance family for 3 generations, his face went from professional to flat-out disgusted. He looked at Caleb, then at the property line, then at the white Mercedes idling at the end of the road where Evelyn was watching through binoculars, and he just shook his head, apologized to us, and told me that filing a false police report was a serious matter, but that his hands were tied unless I wanted to escalate. I told him right then and there, Miller, I'm not just escalating, I'm launching a full-scale offensive, And that afternoon, I sat down with Caleb and our neighbor, a retired accountant named Martha, who had been living in the shadow of Evelyn's thumb for far too long. Martha came over with a manila folder that was so thick it was bursting at the seams, and her hands were shaking, not from age, but from pure cold fury. She told us that Evelyn had been threatening her with, end quote, special assessments, end quote, and fines for her garden, which, by the way, was the most beautiful patch of heirloom tomatoes in the county, unless she kept her mouth shut about the HOA's mysterious, end quote, maintenance fees, end quote. See, Evelyn's husband, Marcus Thorne, ran a shell company called, end quote, Apex Environmental Consulting, end quote. And every month, the HOA was cutting checks for tens of thousands of dollars for, end quote, lake restoration, end quote, and, end quote, invasive species management, end quote, for the subdivision's small retention pond, a pond that was essentially a glorified puddle of algae. Caleb, who had spent his time in the military analyzing logistics and intelligence, took one look at the numbers Martha had managed to sneak out of the annual meeting, and his eyes went wide, because the math didn't end oppos. T just not add up. It screamed, end quote, RICO violation, end quote. We started digging, and the more we dug, the more the stench of corruption overwhelmed even the smell of the pine trees. We found that Evelyn had filed over $2.8 million in insurance claims for, end quote, storm damage, end quote, to community buildings that didn't end oppos. T exist, a clubhouse that was actually just a shed on her own property, a tennis court resurfacing project for a lot that was still just dirt and weeds, and a, end quote, state-of-the-art, end quote, filtration system that was nothing more than a $200 pump from a hardware store. She was an end oppos. T, just a neighborhood tyrant. She was a high-level fraudster using the HOA as a laundromat for insurance money and embezzled dues, and she had been targeting us not because we were an eyesore, but because our lake was the one thing she couldn't end oppos. T control, the one piece of the puzzle that proved her, end quote, environmental, end quote, claims were total fabrications. The climax of this whole mess came 2 weeks later, during the, end quote, emergency community forum, end quote. Evelyn had called to discuss the, end quote, Vance property problem, end quote. She stood on that stage in the community center, looking like a saint in white linen, talking about, end quote, safety, end quote, and, end quote, legacy, end quote, and, end quote, the dignity of our neighborhood, end quote, while I sat in the back with a laptop and a projector I'd borrowed from the local library. When she opened the floor for questions, I didn't in oppos. T asked one. I just walked to the front, plugged in my cable, and showed the entire neighborhood the digital forensics Caleb had uncovered, the photoshopped insurance documents, the bank transfers to Apex Environmental, and the satellite imagery that showed her, end quote, luxurious community amenities, end quote, were nothing but empty grass. The silence in that room was so heavy you could have cut it with a dull knife. And then the back doors opened, and in walked 2 agents from the FBI's white-collar crime division that we'd been talking to for the last 72 hours. Watching Evelyn Thorne get led out of her own meeting in handcuffs, her designer blazer rumpled, and her, end quote, Excalibur, end quote, iPad dropped on the floor, was the single most satisfying moment of my life, but the real victory came later. The forensic audit revealed she and Marcus had siphoned off nearly $4.2 million over 6 years, a staggering amount of money stolen from families who were just trying to pay their mortgages and live in peace. Because of the RICO statutes and the fact that they'd used the mail and wires to commit the fraud, the court didn't end oppos. To just send them to prison, they froze every single asset they had, the Mercedes, the house, the vacation home in Sedona. All of it was liquidated to pay back the residents. Today, the Oak Ridge HOA is a very different place. There are no more, end quote, visual harmony, end quote, patrols, no more fines for gardens, and most importantly, no one bothers Caleb. He's out on that pier every single morning now, the sun reflecting off the water, his rod bent double as he pulls in another lunker, and the neighborhood kids actually come over to learn how to fish from the man they now call the, end quote, captain of the lake. End quote. But I can in oppos. T help but wonder, looking back on all that wreckage, how many other neighborhoods have an Evelyn Thorne hiding in plain sight? How many people are losing their peace of mind because someone with a little bit of power and a lot of greed thinks they can own the air you breathe and the water you fish in? I think we did the right thing. I know we did. But sometimes I wonder if the real mistake wasn't in oppos. T Evelyn in oppos. S but the system in oppos. As for letting someone like her hold the gavel in the first place, what do you think? Is an HOA even worth the trouble, or is it just a breeding ground for this kind of madness? Let me know in the comments, because I have a feeling my story ISN and Oppos. T is rare as I'd like to believe.